Yeah, I think I mean, nothing stops this train for quite a long time. In the United States, the parties are very polarized. Um, and even then, both parties are different than a decade ago. So, for example, the Republican Party back in the Paul Ryan era was interested in cutting entitlement programs. Now, part of the official Republican platform in 2024 is to not touch Social Security, not extend the retirement age, not cut it. And that used to be a Democrat position. The Democrat position is that plus more, right? So one of the few things that the Democrats and Republicans agree on now is basically don't cut the deficit. And there's only a handful of things big enough to cut to meaningfully impact the deficit. So like cutting, education or cutting the FAA or those are like marginal. The big pools of spending that matter are Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, defense, and then some adjacent things like veterans benefits. And practically all of those are not cuttable. So Social Security is now basically enshrined. And part of that's because recipients of Social Security, like people of that age, are the ones that actually vote in high ratios. So that's still the bulk of the voter base. And so both parties consider it just like impossible to cut that. Um, Around the margins, they can try to trim Medicare and Medicaid by kind of going after, like margins of healthcare companies and insurance companies and that, but it's really not meaningful. It's mostly a much deeper problem than that. Given geopolitical issues, if anything, defense is going to go higher, not lower. Um, that's something that is the two parties might disagree on where to put that, but neither side wants to cut defense meaningfully. Veterans benefits is basically locked in, um, and Republicans would very much oppose tax increases, and they are going to have a filibuster in place, which makes it very hard for Democrats to raise taxes, which they want to do. So a lot of that is locked in. And then the further thing is that even if they do, let's say somehow they decided next year we're going to meaningfully raise taxes and we're going to trim spending, and they somehow got the deficit from 7% of GDP down to 2% of GDP. Well, the problem is the U.S. Financial system is like our economy and our tax base is so financialized compared to most other countries, including Europe. And so, generally speaking, when we have our asset prices go sideways or down for a year, our tax receipts start to go sideways or down for a year. And so, ironically, by doing austerity, we could still fail to get the deficit down because we're actually kind of, even if we're trimming spending, we're potentially hurting revenue on the receiving side because it's so correlated with asset prices, partially because of tax changes we did in the 90s and partially because of how kind of top heavy our economic spectrum is. We have more wealth concentration and therefore more tax revenues tied to financial market performance. Um, and so nothing short of a major restructuring would make any sort of dent in the deficits. And that's something that is just very unlikely given the polarized state of politics. So I would describe less than a 1% chance that any sort of meaningful deficit reduction happens in the next 5+ years. And so I think that's a structural background phenomenon that as investors we have to deal with.